Hello, this is Mike Swanson. You're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. In a few moments, I'm going to be speaking of a very special guest. I'm going to talk with Scott Horton. Scott Horton runs the Libertarian Institute. You can find that at libertarianinstitute.org. He also is a news manager for antiwar.com and has done hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews over the years with experts on foreign policy and geopolitics. And he's just issued a book that's a compilation of the interviews he's done with Ron Paul on these topics. The book is titled aptly, The Great Ron Paul, perhaps the leading figure when it comes to the idea of non-interventionism in foreign affairs, which has gotten a little bit of news in regards to Donald Trump and this situation in Syria with the Kurds and Turkey. But last week, when it comes to the financial markets, all the news was about China and trade and whether or not Trump was going to be able to do a trade deal with China or not. The week started out with some tensions that put a risk that there would be no deal at all. This had been something that had been building up now for weeks, if not months, with this critical date of last Friday of deal or no deal. And if there wasn't going to be a deal, the stock market probably would have dumped substantially or started to decline. Now, what happened, though, on Friday was some sort of deal was made, and the stock market rallied into a pre-announcement of that news, which culminated with a press conference with Trump in the Oval Office and the Chinese trade negotiator in Trump's negotiation team. And Trump heralded this deal. There was excitement, there was relief, there's no doubt about that. And the stock market did good that day. But now, as the weekend passed, if you followed the financial news, now they're wondering if a deal at all was made. Or in my thought is this is really a trade truce. It came out today that China wants to negotiate more before they'll make any deal. So there we are, kind of, in a certain sense, we're back to square one. But the situation is better than it was a week ago when it comes to this issue. A failure, or I should say an increase in trade tensions between the United States and China will not only be bad for the stock market, but really it's bad for the economy, it's bad for the world. So it's good that things are better than they were a week ago. However, the excitement of Friday is kind of dissipated. It doesn't mean the stock market's going to dump. Doesn't mean we're in a situation of immediate risk off, but the excitement is gone. And I think we're returning now to the stock market is going to depend over the next 2 weeks on earnings, and also people looking forward to the Federal Reserve meeting at the end of the month, in which the Fed's expected to lower interest rates. So we're sort of in a holding pattern once again. That is also a story that is nothing different, because it seems like the stock market has been in a holding pattern now since March. So there we are. That's my thoughts on what's happening in the stock market at this moment and how we should think about the trade news last week. Not as exciting as it seemed to be at first hand, kind of back to square one. That means we'll have to see what happens with this new round of negotiations. But it definitely was a trade truce. So all that said, let's turn in a few seconds to Scott Horton after this quick little break.
Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, I'm interested in the truth about the JFK assassination.
Right. Well, what do you want to know?
Judy Baker's wild claim, Oswald girlfriend, she knew Ruby and Barry, cancer weapons. Really?
I imagine I could claim I have 4 wheels. It doesn't make me a wagon, but okay.
Oswald was on the kill team and trying to prevent the murder of John Kennedy. Come on now, has a real expert on the JFK assassination looked into her claims?
Go to Amazon.com, enter Judith Baker in her own words. You'll get results for a digital copy of a book where Walt Brown utilizes her own words and the known evidence in the case to get at, well, a different perspective, let's say. You can get Judith Barry Baker in her own words from the author himself, signed if you request it, by contacting Dr. Brown at KIASJFK@AOL.com. It's a fun book, and it actually dissects the many, many fantastic claims. Judith Barry Baker in her own words.
Thank you for all the great information.
And now I'm here with Scott Horton, who runs the libertarianinstitute.com. How you doing today, Scott?
.org.
Oh,
Even better.
.org. There we go. Yep. And it is an organization, not just a website. So it's an honor to talk with you because I've been listening to your show since the time the Iraq War started.
Really? Has it been that long? And thank you for having me. Great to talk to you. Of course.
Oh, yeah. And I've learned so much about foreign policy because what you do is interview basically the top experts on that subject. I mean, you by tuning in and going and listening to the podcast, I mean, I hear stuff you'll never hear on television.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you value it so much, man. And I guess, full disclosure, I literally couldn't do it without you, Mike. So extra thanks for that. Advertiser on the show for quite a few years now.
Yeah. Me and several other people, do that. And it's an important show to say the least. And one of the guests you've had over the years is Ron Paul, the great Ron Paul, which is the title of a new book that you just put out, carrying some of your interviews.
Yeah. So I'm really proud of it. It took a lot longer to put together than I thought it might. But anyway, one very generous donor ponied up for the cost to hire this company to do all the transcripts. And then we just edited the hell out of them and took a few months to get it ready there. And then with the help of some friends, put it out under the Libertarian Institute banner there, imprint. And what it is it's the transcripts of all 38 of my interviews of Dr. Paul. And then also a speech that I gave all about the greatness of him is there toward the end of the book too. The second to last chapter, I guess, is a speech I gave a year ago, last November in Houston. But so anyway, yeah. It's really great. And of course it's Ron Paul, who's the greatest American hero ever, who it's not just that he's right about everything as far as, boy, I don't think our government should be doing this terrible thing they're doing, which is of course what he says about everything. But of course, he really is a plumb line libertarian and really understands the philosophy and the economics and of course the foreign policy and the history and all of these things in the very best way. He's among the best libertarians. And then, of course, he had this, extremely important role as Dr. No in the House of Representatives for all of those years. And then, of course, the Ron Paul revolutions came when he ran for president. And he really took libertarianism from, the far fringes to a mainstream position that must be reckoned with. It's not that we have the real power and influence, but they can no longer pretend we don't exist. We spend half our time telling various different liberals and conservatives that, no, you're not a libertarian. Stop calling yourself that, just because, people like the sound of it anyway. And people are so over the corrupt neoliberal and neoconservative imperial center. They're looking for other answers, and we're the ones who have them. And Dr. Paul is, of course, the most important one of us in the sense of his access to the minds of the American people, especially through his presidential campaigns and all those speeches he gave. I always said that those presidential campaigns were really just the greatest speaking tour on behalf of peace and liberty that anybody ever gave. And the thing is, too, is he would, again, because he really understands this stuff, he would really explain it. And he would tell these kids, you know what you should do? You should take all your presidential campaign donation money and you should spend it on books by Mises and Rothbard. You know, I mean, this is his thing. And unfortunately, he never won the presidency. But I don't think there's really any question that he has done more to spread the ideas of peace and liberty. You know, the real libertarian unified field theory of liberty, not just the word and a slogan here and there, but, you know, real libertarian theory, to more people than anyone ever. And, you know, the closest comparison probably would be the Declaration of Independence. But, you know, there's a lot of baggage mixed with that in a way that he just doesn't have. And I think going forward, for, you know, assuming the politicians don't get us all killed in an H-bomb war, I think that, you know, for thousands of years, or at least hundreds and hundreds of years, people will know the name Ron Paul when all of the rest of this movement's forgotten for what he's done. So I'm honored that I've had the chance to interview him all these times and ask him all these great questions. And then, you know, I get to put this book out, which really just shows all of his wisdom about what's going on and why it doesn't have to be the way it is this whole time for the last 15 years.
Well, I first heard of him probably after 1999. I'm not sure the exact year, time goes by, but I remember him interviewing Alan Greenspan or questioning Alan Greenspan in congressional hearings about the banking system when Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the stock market at the time was in a bear market, and the bubble of the internet was deflating and so forth, and Greenspan was lowering interest rates. And that was my first exposure to him, and through him, the idea really of Austrian economics and helping me to understand the monetary cycle and what's going on in the long run in the financial markets and so forth, and not so much his anti-war message. That wasn't my first, you know, when I first saw him, I didn't think of him necessarily as this anti-war, anti-interventionist figure, and probably didn't even understand his importance to that until after 9/11 happened. And the funny thing about it is, I was always someone interested in that stuff anyway, and when I was younger, you know, read about the Vietnam War and the events of the 1960s and before, and people associate the peace movement of that era with liberals or left-wingers and so forth. But after 9/11, it seems to me the libertarian anti-interventionist movement was much more prominent, and that's what I was able to encounter and find on the internet, with Ron Paul perhaps being the leader of it.
Yeah, I mean, and so there's a couple of things there on the different levels of it, right? Is on the most important level, all of this foreign policy is just madness. It's murder, suicide. It's destroying. It's the worst thing about our society, no question. And so that means then that, in contrast, his opposition and his leadership on this issue has been hugely important, and important for, you know, not just, I don't mean it like making libertarians look good or whatever, but it's more really helping to define this issue as the most important issue for libertarians. And so that then is important that other people see that, you know, hedge fund guys like you and right-wing Christian conservatives like, you know, Jim or Joe or whoever, and that, you know, left liberal progressives and socialists and whatever, that they see that too, that everybody sees. That this guy Ron Paul says, yeah, Social Security. Here's what we have to do is bring our troops home right now. We can't afford this empire. That's what's wrong. And saying it over and over. And look at the example he sets on the Liberty Report, day in and day out, 4 days a week. Him and Dan McAdams, full straight anti-imperialism, not just against whatever the government is doing, but deconstructing and disproving the narratives behind everything the government is doing. He's, I think, 83 or 84 now. He's not retiring. He's just kicking ass. Anti-war stuff every day. And like you're saying, he provides sort of a entryist angle into his position for everyone around. This was what was always so great about his campaign. I remember his first fundraiser here in Austin was at the Bob Bullock Museum. And there's a guy in a suit and a guy with a giant red mohawk. And someone was saying, oh, no, this is terrible. Get that guy off the TV. And I'm saying, no, that's perfect. Because it raises the question, why would a guy in a big red mohawk like a guy like Ron Paul, the same guy that the guy in the suit likes so much? What is it there that matters so much? And then you ask the guy in the mohawk, and he's like, listen, inflation is destroying our society. That and the wars, the boom and bust cycle, right? And all this stuff. It's perfect for showing that, and for that matter, the drug wars and all of the federalization and militarization of the police and all of the different issues that Ron leads on, that it doesn't matter who you are. You can see, one, that he's an honest guy. He means what he says. He votes the way he says, unlike the rest of these guys. And you can tell he's really just up there to educate you, as he always emphasizes. Education of the masses is the key. Getting the people to agree with us. That's the silver bullet, man. That's the solution, is winning the argument over, the majority of people, really, that repealing everything and embracing freedom is the solution to our problems. And so people can just tell he's genuine. So it doesn't matter. You could be anybody on the spectrum, black or white, town or country, East Coast, West Coast, or Midwest, or you could be a manager or a owner, or you could be a wage slave or whatever it is, a skateboarder, and this is your guy. And listen to all the things that he says. They're all right, And when you go through that book, look at him. Korea and Vietnam and Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and all of the economic problems and everything. It's all in there. I only regret I didn't start interviewing him as soon as I found him in 1997 when he first came back to Congress. And, here was a guy who right away was, willing to criticize the Republicans just as badly as the Democrats for the things that they were doing. In fact, I've told the story before about, and it's in the book, I tell the story about the first time I ever saw him on TV. He was denouncing Bush Sr. for selling chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein in the time leading right up until the invasion of Kuwait. So, and it says R, Texas at the bottom of the screen. That's who you're dealing with there. And so that's what's so great about him is, he would caucus with the Republicans and wear that label, but he was really there to teach the society in general rather than play political games with Newt Gingrich and whoever.
Well, what do you think, like, one thing about today, I mean, with the news cycle and everything, it's so dominated by Donald Trump, but the reality is, whether someone listening likes Donald Trump or hates him or whatever, the reality is I don't think he'd be president if it wasn't for the disastrous wars of the Middle East and the economic melees that has been linked to it or is linked to it. Yep. That Ron Paul warned us about. So, but the sad thing about that is, because the news media, mainstream media at least, not include Fox News in that, is so dominated by the news of Trump, all these past events that explain why Trump even became president are just not talked about or pushed aside or whatever. Right. And I think Ron Paul keeps us straight, and so does your show, frankly, on this bigger picture. But where I don't know where all this is going now.
Well, it's going toward the next centrist establishment failure, because, like you're saying, they're only listening to themselves about just how outrageous this guy is, and they're, as many great commentators have pointed out, they're basically covering up for their own failures. That essentially the entire post-Cold War economic and foreign policy has been a complete disaster. And, I think everybody knows. You don't have to really be any kind of partisan or any kind of thing like that. In fact, in spite of people's partisanship, I think people know that the government hates them, that the government doesn't care about justice, liberty, and justice for all. That's not true. You get in the crosshairs of a prosecutor for whatever reason, they will bury you. You're free to do what you want within the following 100,000 rules and regulations you've never even heard of before. Nobody goes around saying this is a free country. Go ahead, it's a free country. Nobody says that. They used to say that back in the 1980s and maybe the early 90s. Nobody says that. Go ahead, it's a free country, because that's laughable. And people know that whatever the billionaire, the most powerful billionaire bankers in America get a bailout while everyone else has to go bankrupt and suffer, when we all know that it's the government and the big bankers who engineer deliberately or through ignorance and or both these terrible booms and busts in the first place. They are always protected, and none of us are. And just the same as our generals all lead from behind. They say that was Obama. Show me an officer that died. The only officer that died in Afghanistan was just fragged. Some guy snuck up on him and killed him. Wasn't in a battle anywhere in the entire terror war. And that was a general. There have been maybe a colonel or two have been killed. Very few, though. The rest of the officer corps, they stay safe at home in Tampa or in Virginia and send these kids out to fight a generation-long war against anywhere there happens to be Sunni insurgents or Iranian interests on the other side in play.
Am I right
in
saying
people feel that? They feel like, oh, we're expendable and you guys are our overlords, huh? I mean, remember, they announced years in advance, it was unavoidable, that your choice in 2016 is going to be between Bill Clinton's wife and George Bush's brother. That's your choice, and you're going to love it. And those two families, of course, represent this entire centrist consensus, this entire generation's long consensus now. And that's what people were rejecting, and that's what people are going to continue to reject because of how corrupt it is and how bankrupt it all is. And meanwhile, TV is saying, no, the only problem is that Russia bought some Facebook ads to trick you into voting against your interest, Hillary Clinton.
Am I right in I was just thinking as you're talking that the CENTCOM command, it's not in the Middle East, but it's in Florida, and CENTCOM's the command for the Middle East. Am I right in that?
That's right.
That's just
I mean, what are they going to do? Put it in Jordan or something? That'd be too much.
It's
right?
crazy.
It's like inviting the Israelis to help us fight Iraq, even though we fought 2 Iraq wars partially for Israel's interest. They can't come with us in the thing because that would be a little bit too obvious, huh?
I mean, during the Vietnam War, the theater command was CINCPAC, which was in Hawaii. So for people to understand, the theater commander of the Middle East is in Florida.
And last I heard, the commander of AFRICOM, that whole base is still in Germany. Because they can't find a country that's willing to be that obvious of a sock puppet satellite of the United States. So they can't even put it in Djibouti.
It's just crazy. But I could keep asking you questions for hours on end about what's going on in current events. So I will stop doing that.
Let's get back to the greatness of Ron Paul.
One thing about Ron Paul is that despite like I said, somewhere in the 1999 or 2001 is when I first really paid attention to him, and he was warning of the consequences of the Fed's monetary policy, and then he warned about what would happen in Iraq and in Afghanistan too, for that matter. And all these bad consequences have happened, and I think most people feel that the country today is in a much worse position it was 19 years ago, much less 10 years ago. But despite that, Ron Paul, I think he seems to be an optimistic person. He doesn't stop doing what he's doing. So what do you think keeps him optimistic? or
Yeah,
motivated.
I'm glad you asked that, because that was my first question for him. Or no, it was my last question for him in my first interview of him, right there in chapter 1 of the book. And it's actually a question that I got from Karen Katowski, who happened to also be at the Libertarian Party National Convention in May of 2004 in Atlanta. And I was like, had my list of questions. Oh my God, I'm going to finally meet and interview Ron Paul here in person. Jeff Dice wouldn't let him come on my show because it was pirate radio. So, but here I'm going to be in person. I'm going to record the thing. And so I'm writing up my questions and I'm like, man, I need one more question. I don't know. So Karen Katowski says, well, why don't you ask him, hey, if there's only one Ron Paul in the House, and there only ever is going to be one Ron Paul in all of history, as we all know, what hope do we have? I mean, just how screwed are we here? What are we going to do? Something like that. And so then he says, I asked him that. And then he says, well, he learned the lesson from the fall of the Soviet Union that, you know what, you don't really know what's going to happen. And that our job as libertarians is not to go around predicting doom. I mean, we could warn of consequences of bad policies and that kind of thing. But our job is not necessarily to go around predicting the worst and fretting about the future. It's our job truly is teaching people about liberty and that this is the better way. And we can, of course, use all the bad consequences of state action to prove our case. But as far as just assuming that things are never going to change, things are only going to get worse, he said, in the 1980s, there were some economists who said that ultimately communism cannot work and that kind of thing. But hardly anyone thought that the Soviet Union would cease to exist by Christmas 91. I mean, that was absolutely incomprehensible in the year 1987. There was no way anybody thought so. And then all of a sudden, the whole thing was over. And with hardly a shot fired, very, very, very few people killed in the process of a massive, however many tens of thousands of square miles sized empire falling apart there. It was a miracle. And he said, so the answer is, essentially you can't predict the future, so don't. Just keep doing the right thing and keep teaching people about why freedom is right and hope that, count on the fact that eventually one day the remnant is going to win this argument because we're the ones who know what we're talking about.
Well, you could almost flip that around and say, if no one is optimistic and no one talks about freedom, well, you can then guarantee things will get worse in the long run.
Right.
There's no way out of it.
Yeah.
No
question.
one's willing to fight the good fight. There you go, right?
And so, look, I mean, I think the real crisis of our time right now is, you know what, I'll be a little bit personal here. I think it's all Rand's fault. And whatever. He just doesn't have the vision. He didn't understand. But look at in hindsight now, look at how with the failure of the center, the Bush-Clinton centrist, neo everything, whatever consensus, not so moderate consensus. With that failure, everybody's moving further to the right and the left, becoming more nationalist and more socialist and sometimes more national socialist. And so, no, wrong. That's not what's supposed to be going on here. You're supposed to be still in the center, but the other center, the center at the top up here, freedom, not the center down there in totalitarian slavery under, the compromise where everybody gets whatever law they want to our compromise and nobody gets it. Everybody gets freedom instead. And so Ron Paul, when he was running for president, he was there, carrying that torch and explaining, listen, freedom really works. We don't need to move further to the right. We don't need to move further to the left. What we need is just to embrace liberty. And so, that is the true moderate middle in a, Walter moderate Block sense there, as he says, moderate is his middle name. They're like, well, yeah, right. Live and let live. That is the moderate position, not authoritarian compromise. And so Rand didn't have the vision to see that, okay, now that the old dad is retiring back to Texas, it's time for him to really lead that banner. Instead, he thought the idea was to try to sort of be like a liberal Republican, right? Like a sellout LP type a liberal Republican who sort of tries to pander to all sides, instead of a libertarian Republican who is there to be the polar opposite of the moderate centrist as well as of the far left and right. You know, real libertarianism for the people. And since he didn't pick up that torch, it just fell onto the ground. So we have a movement out here in the world, but we don't have a locus of leadership for the media to focus on. Certainly no one who really gets it right the way Ron did. So we're really suffering from that now. We really need someone to say, no. You guys, here's where they're wrong and here's what is right that we all ought to be able to agree on. And by the way, it's all really obvious, right? You end all the wars, no bailouts, no corporate welfare. You end the drug war, repeal the federalization of everything and all the centralization of power in D.C. as much as possible. I mean, that's an agenda that's not so much an ideological agenda as – or I guess it is, but it's one that all the different factions ought to be able to agree on, you know, if it's put forward well.
Well, there's a handful of, let's say, libertarians in the Congress. There was one, I don't know if he's still in there, but there was one in North Carolina. He's the one that, if I'm correct, said he was against French fries or something.
Oh yeah, Walter Jones. Yeah, no, he died early this year. Actually,
did? Okay, so he
he was a conservative. He wasn't really a libertarian, but he did become a good anti-war conservative. Mm-hmm. And you know, Thomas Massey is there. Thomas Massey's good, and you know, Justin Amash, for what he's worth, you know, he's less worse than most. I got to be fair to the guy. You know, he's not my ideal. I like Thomas Massey a lot. And, you know, Thomas Massey has that, you know, Ron Paulian personality, too, of just being a friendly, sort of smiling, kind of a decent sort of a fellow, which is helpful. You know what I mean? A lot of these congressmen.
But I guess to get nationally known, they would have
to, you know.
I guess to get nationally known, they would have to run in the Republican primary or something. I mean, the closest thing, I guess, and I don't think she's a libertarian by one stretch of the imagination, is Tulsi Gabbard. Seems to have the interest of some of the people that, you know, liked Ron Paul or supported Ron Paul in the past.
Yeah. Well, we just want to see an end of the wars.
Yeah.
And she talks the best game out of any of them.
Yeah.
Although I think, you know, she really does fall short. But, you know, after it's sort of like the Constitution. From here, that's 90% of the way to anarcho-capitalism. So, you know, I don't know. So she says, look, we're going to have only a terror war, but we're going to call off all of the bait and switch regime change wars and all of the rest of this stuff, all the wars for terrorism. You know, I don't know. I hate to call that 90% of the way to peace, but it's like 60. So
it's better than the rest of them.
Yeah. She's, again, less worse than a lot of the others.
Right. But, well, I don't want to keep you all day, so I'll tell people to get your book. It's on Amazon.com. If they just type The Great Ron Paul, they can get it and then see some of the most important interviews you've done over the years. And also go to libertarianinstitute.org and see what's going on. What's going on with the Institute, by the way, anyway?
Well, besides this, we also just published a brand new book by the great Sheldon Richman, co-founder and executive editor of the site, and it's called Coming to Palestine. And it's a collection of essays that he wrote from 88 to 94, and then from 2014 through 19. And the last bit there, a series that he wrote for the Libertarian Institute. And it's just great. I mean, it is the definitive libertarian take on Israel-Palestine. And I strongly urge everyone to read it. It's a short 200 pages, 40 very short chapters. You know, they're all, you know, relatively brief essays. And you just, you know, breeze right through it, and you'll have a whole new understanding of the Zionist project there for sure, I promise. And from the best libertarian point of view. So everything is through the eyes of individual rights rather than any sort of collective tribal claim to ancient prophecy or any kind of thing like that. Who tilled the land? who was on it, who owned it, who stole it. Things become pretty black and white once you approach these things from the right questions. So, The Great Sheldon Richman, Coming to Palestine, now available too.
Well, I'll have to check that one out because I got his one of his previous books, or most recent ones, about the founding fathers. I think it was called The Counter Revolution, but I read it.
Which is great. Yeah,
yeah, it's fantastic.
About how we should have just stuck with the Articles of Confederation, essentially.
But he shows the arguments that were going on by the different founding fathers and so forth during the Constitutional Convention and going into it, which people really aren't aware of at all. It's really fascinating. But well, anyway, thanks for taking the time to do this interview with me, and hopefully we'll do one sometime in the future.
Thank you very much for having me, Mike.